about Lookout Mountain and people from North
John Ross
Carolina.
there, right?
They were giving land away on Lookout Mountain. Indians still
Yeah.
want
So you see John Ross.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
John Ross was born in 1790 in an area called Turkey Town, and where that is a little bit north of Rome.
No.
He died in 1866. Hello? He was born of a Scottish father and a mother who was part Cherokee. He grew up as a Native American, although he was educated at something called the Kingston Academy, and I could not find anything about the Kingston Academy. I don't know what that was. In 1816, Ross settled along the river above Chattanooga Creek. He established a trading post there. That was considered the northern border of the Cherokee Nation. In the early 19th century, he became the leader of the Cherokee resistance to the white man's acquisition of their land. From 1819 to 1826, he was the president of the Cherokee National Council, and I don't believe that that National Council was ever as national as we think of the term. A lot of different Cherokee chiefs considered themselves independent, and when it was given to the United States, it was only some chiefs who signed off on that. 5 years later, he became the principal chief of the nation. He was headquartered at New Echota. He had a constitution. The Cherokee had a written constitution, and he helped draft it. For challenging the government, he was then put in prison. His home was confiscated. He wrote petitions to Andrew Jackson. He had fought with Jackson during the Creek War, and Jackson paid him no mind. Now, the early settlement in 1817, still a Cherokee nation, a board of commissioners for foreign missions established a mission and a school at Brainerd. I don't know how many of you ever seen this little sign out there, but that was the Brainerd mission. Its purpose was to educate and Christianize the Cherokee. During the 21 years of its existence, it drew many prominent people, including James Monroe, President of the United States, who were still accepting it as Cherokee land. The first known settlement of traders here in the Chattanooga area and in St. Elmo was made in 1828. Following year, when John Ross became chief, he established a small trading post, which was nothing but a cluster of huts on the riverbank. It was called Ross's Landing. Trading between the Indians and the white man became so active that a man named Billy Gentry established and operated a ferry across the Tennessee River.
And then they had a bunch of huts on Ross's Landing.
Yes, they did. Interestingly, I've been reading a little bit about what the Tennessee River was like in that era or before all the dams and whatnot. There were many different places that the river was no more than 3 feet deep. So it was not hard to ford the river except during the rainy season. During the rainy season, it was very, very difficult because the river went crazy. The friendliness of the Cherokees encouraged white traders starting to move in with their families, and they were living in Cherokee land. And then by 1836, the federal government became active in the effort to remove the Indians. And really the state that was most active in all of that was Georgia. And what Georgia wanted was the land where they had discovered gold. That's really the initiative that stimulated the government to kick the Cherokee out. In 1838, Cherokee land allegedly was signed over to the United States. Thus began the Trail of Tears. I want to talk a little bit about the early white settlement in the state of Tennessee beyond just Chattanooga.
So there was a fort here?
Mhm.
A man named Donaldson, who was from Virginia, was an early settler of Middle Tennessee. He led over 100 settlers on a journey down the Tennessee River, past Chattanooga, or what was then Ross's Landing, to the Cumberland settlement during the winter of 79-80. That settlement became
Remember
Nashville.
the fort on the river? Yeah.
Now, a different man named James White from Rowan County, North Carolina in 1783 led an expedition into the upper Tennessee Valley, and he erected a fort there. It's called White's Fort. That became the capital of something they call the Southwest Territory in 1790. Eventually, it would become Knoxville. So both Nashville and Knoxville had founding histories very, very specifically associated with specific people and specific groups of people. Chattanooga did not. Chattanooga had a less distinctive story. Traders who were living around Ross's Landing, mostly in St. Elmo, were the foundation of Chattanooga, and it started to grow. In 1839, just a year after the Native Americans were gone, the village of Chattanooga itself was established north of the mouth of Chattanooga Creek. And if you know where Chattanooga Creek flows, part of it, I think, flows underground in some kind of a cistern, or not cistern, but some kind of a great big tunnel. I don't know who built that or when it was built. In 1840, the state of Tennessee began to sell property formerly owned, and this is property that's already been sold for 2 cents an acre 50 years earlier, at the rate of $7.50 an acre. And much of Lookout Mountain and the surrounding land was purchased by the Whitesides and the Cravens family, and you know about Craven's house. Now, Chattanooga before the Civil War. The Chattanooga town was established in 1839 by the Tennessee legislature. It had what was called a board of constables for its city government. The area, and they knew this all along, the area was rich in ore, coal, and other metallic ores, and that drew miners and other industries into the area. And what they needed was transportation to markets. In 1849, the Western and Atlantic Railroad, and that's the railroad from Atlanta to Chattanooga, and on the other end to Savannah, began operating. That was the first railroad into Chattanooga. In 1851, the legislature incorporated the city of Chattanooga. They appointed a city marshal and a number of policemen. So the city started to get formed in the early 1850s. In 1854, the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad began operating. That was the road that actually, I think, terminated in Louisville, but it was Nashville and Chattanooga section was opened in 1854.
Hey, George,
Yeah,
can I just
yeah.
Hamilton County formed, and was Chattanooga the seat of Hamilton County?
Not initially, no. The seat was, shoot, it was up there north of
Up there, Ottawa?
Ottawa, and I can't remember the name of it. Was it Franklin? It was the original county seat.
It's underwater now.
Okay, thanks, Dan. The Memphis and Charleston Railroad, connected with the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, was completed in 1857. That was the first railroad to actually link the Atlantic Ocean with the Mississippi. The first passenger station we know, or I knew anyway, as Union Station and Car Shed, was built in 1858. It was built primarily for freight shipment and for maintenance of the railroad cars. At the same time, the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad connected Chattanooga with Knoxville. So by 1858, Chattanooga had connections north, east, south, and west. It was more of a railroad hub than Atlanta was. And this is what it looked like in 1860. This is the road down to Atlanta, the road up to Knoxville, the road over to Memphis, and then the road to Nashville. Chattanooga, the only thing that was interesting about it, when you came into Union Station, you couldn't come in going through Union Station, you had to back in. All of these trains, when they came into Chattanooga, had to stop, turn around, and back in. Okay, our industrial beginnings. Now that you've got these 4 railroads and all this shipping is going on, they needed hotels, restaurants, and saloons, and they started appearing pretty quickly. They also built warehouses, and the warehouses were primarily for grain, timber, and cotton, but other raw materials. They were built near the rail yards. They also built corrals in the city for holding livestock. Businessmen started creating factories for ironworking. I don't know how many of you have been up to the Dunlop coke ovens. I thought about doing some stuff about coke, and then I kind of lost interest. They also did some furniture manufacturing here before the war, some textile production, and then they shipped their products out on rail. These businesses then drew more people into Chattanooga. Shops, schools, and churches appeared, as did doctors, lawyers, and government agencies. There's a surprise. In 1849, now I'm going back a little bit before the railroads, the Chattanooga Foundry and Machine Works was established. It was, to the best of what I could find, it was the earliest foundry I could find in Chattanooga. It had a foundry of 15 tons of daily capacity, a machine shop with the machinery necessary to do heavy iron work, and a blacksmith shop. Later on, they produced steam engines, the biggest steam engines built south of the Ohio River. They could blow a cylinder 7 feet in diameter with a 4-foot stroke. A lot of work that was done here was done to support the railroads, mills, bridges, water, and gas works. During the war, what was added to this operation were sawmills, because what they realized was they needed a lot of facilities. In particular, they needed hospitals. Chattanooga was one big hospital for 4 years. Warehouses and other buildings were also constructed. East Tennessee Iron Manufacturing started operations in 1853. They built a blast furnace on the Tennessee River, right next to what is now the Hunter Museum. A steamboat brought ore and coal from upriver, converted it into pig iron, then put it back onto more river craft going out downriver. Several of the owners of the Tennessee Manufacturing Company formed the Etna Mining and Manufacturing Company. Initially, they formed to operate the coal mines along the constructed railroads. A man named Thomas Webster moved in 1857 to Chattanooga and set up his own foundry, the Chattanooga Foundry and Iron Machine Works. It was erected on King Street near South Market. During the Civil War, that foundry made ammunition and cast cannons. One of the largest cannons was dubbed the Lady Lila in honor of a Webster daughter. They also produced much of the machinery for the copper operations over in Ducktown. Thomas Webster was my great-great-grandfather. Lila was my great-grandmother. Now, Chattanooga at the time of the Civil War. With railroads connecting in all directions, coupled with the river, it had the best transportation network in the South. By 1860, the population of the county was 13,000. 2,500 lived in the city of Chattanooga. Of these, about 10% were slaves. The Aetna Mining and Manufacturing Company was formed to operate the coal mines in the county. It eventually operated 18 different mines, but few of them were actually coal mines. I think they were more in the business of iron ore mining. The Big Soddy coal mines, number 1 and 5, were at the head of Big Soddy Gulch. And I believe Big Soddy Gulch runs this way. Okay, that's Signal Mountain. On June the 24th of 1861, Isham Harris, who was governor, proclaimed the state separated from the United States. That did not happen when the original Confederacy was formed. It followed a referendum that rejected secession. They held a referendum in Tennessee in the early part of 1861, and the state refused to agree with it. The second referendum was held in June, and that referendum was held after Charleston was bombarded, after Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, and it was approved. However, East Tennessee never did agree to the Confederacy. They formed a resolution to stay in the Union. The state legislature ignored them. Soon Confederate forces were occupying Chattanooga. They started with the 7th Alabama Volunteers and then several Tennessee regiments. So Chattanooga was occupied from the middle of 1861 until the very end. What does a city at war look like? Two different things. First of all, the men in the community started forming military units, volunteers. Eventually, they sent 17 companies to the Confederacy. Women's auxiliaries were formed, primarily in the garment manufacturing business. They organized a home guard. A provost marshal was appointed. All of the coal and iron mines in the area were turned to war production. Guano deposits were located at Nickajack and Lookout Mountain caves. And what they were doing is they were producing gunpowder, with guano being one of the primary ingredients, sulfur, and I forget what the other one is. Doesn't matter. A Union supporters group formed near Sale Creek. I didn't know about this. So up in Sale Creek, a Union group formed. They were dispersed later in that year in something called Cliff's War. 300 or 400 Confederate sympathizers from our county descended upon them and dispersed them. There was very little fighting, maybe some fist fighting, and a couple of people were hurt. However, that same group, several months later, hit railroad bridges in our area and destroyed 5 bridges, including 2 spans east of Missionary Ridge. Apparently they were very good though at building and rebuilding bridges, because bridges were being destroyed on an ongoing basis. A number of other Union sympathizers formed to assist those seeking to avoid Confederate authorities. They did not want to participate in the war. There were a lot of conflict, but very little blood was shed. Now, once Nashville fell, and Nashville fell right after the battles of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, they realized that Nashville could not be held. Nashville had no natural defenses. So what happened was they evacuated Nashville and they sent everything here to Chattanooga. Supplies clogged up the railroad. Refugees included several thousand wounded men mostly from Fort Donelson. Among others, the Crutchfield House became the Ford Hospital, but they did not have enough beds for all of these wounded people, and many of them wound up sleeping on the floor. But the things that I read said that not many of them, or not that many of them, died because of shortage of facilities. Shiloh, I'm not going to talk about it much, but 150 miles west of us was the Battle of Shiloh. And at the same time, and it actually was intentionally at the same time, Anderson's raiders passed through Chattanooga going to Atlanta. They commandeered a train there, the general, and their plan was to damage the new railroad line from Atlanta to Chattanooga. I'm also not going to talk that much about Anderson's raiders. They tore up a little bit of track, but they were pursued so closely that they were not able to do what their major intent was, which was to burn bridges. All 22 raiders were captured. Those that were captured were brought to Chattanooga. I never did understand why only 8 were hanged, 8 escaped, and the other 6 were exchanged. The ones who were exchanged were the first recipients of the National Medal of Honor. Following Shiloh, another Tennessee regiment was sent to Chattanooga because they realized by then how important Chattanooga was. In June of '62, a Union force actually occupied Signal Mountain. A general named Negley, he shelled the city and then he left. But it told people, you are under observation. Among other things that were built here in the city was an armory. Its primary function was to repair small arms, and there were about 30 or 40 men working in the armory. Medical treatment was really haphazard. A number of warehouse facilities were converted into hospitals. If you read about the medical part of Chattanooga, I think somebody ought to do a much more elaborate study of that. A doctor came to Chattanooga, set up a medical program for the Confederacy. Now, it was still occupied by the Confederates. Trained people, nurses' aides and whatnot. It was considered to be one of the best medical facilities in the Confederacy. Chattanooga became a medical center. For almost 2 years, it was inundated with casualties from Bragg's Army of the Tennessee. In July of '62, Hamilton County became headquarters of Bragg's Army of the West. 27,000 Confederate troops were in Chattanooga. And trying to understand where they were all located, a lot of them were out at Tyner. A lot of them were outside what we consider the city. But 27,000 troops in a town of 10,000 is a lot of people. At the same time, the Union forces were over in Huntsville. So after Shiloh, the Union Army penetrated North Alabama, posing a threat to this area. What Bragg did, he went north. His intent was to draw the Union forces from Huntsville back north. He wanted to eliminate the occupation of Tennessee. He marched with these 27,000 men plus some others across Walden's Ridge and then up Sequatchie Valley. He got to Kentucky and he was defeated at a battle called Perryville. He retreated back into Tennessee, where he was then again defeated at Stones River. Closed 1862. Sorry about that. In early '63, Rosecrans, who was the Army of the Cumberland Union Army commander, he outmaneuvered Bragg in Middle Tennessee, and the next thing they knew, the Confederate Army had retreated all the way to Chattanooga. So by early '63, the Army of the Tennessee was back in Chattanooga. They brought a lot of wounded men with them. It was back to huge numbers of people in hospitals. In August of '63, Wilder's cavalry brigade reached Stringer's Ridge. That was the beginning of Bragg's withdrawal from Chattanooga. They started an artillery duel with Confederate artillery that was on Cameron Hill. A river steamer was sunk, the depot was shelled, the Crutchfield House was damaged, many homes were hit by shells. The bombardment continued for over a month. However, by then, Rosecrans had decided how to outmaneuver Bragg again, like he had done in Middle Tennessee. And the left wing of the Union Army followed Wilder into Chattanooga. And what Bragg did then was evacuate all these men who were wounded down to Marietta. That became the hospital center. Rosecrans marched across Sand and Lookout Mountains, and Bragg's army left the city. They were not forced out of the city. However, with Rosecrans on his flank, he ran the risk of being surrounded. Wilder's forces entered the city on 9 September 1863. Bragg was, they thought, headed towards Dalton. And if you read about what went on in the next 2 weeks, it almost was funny about they didn't know where each other was. They couldn't decide what to do about it. They'd make one plan, that plan wouldn't work. They'd make another plan. If you think about Chickamauga as a planned action, Chickamauga was a last ditch of about 3 different plans that Bragg had. But first, I want to do a Jerry diversion and talk about a newspaper called the Chattanooga Rebel. A man named Francis Paul established the Chattanooga Daily Rebel in August of 1862. There were 2 newspapers in town up until that time, but they merged and then they suspended their publication. One journalist writing for the Rebel criticized Bragg's military operations, and Bragg threatened to ban the paper from his camps. They also had another journalist who was providing a witty side to every issue that was very, very much enjoyed by both the soldiers, the men, women, and children in the rear. By the way, they were printing 8,000 copies, and a copy went anywhere from 2 cents to 5 cents. I think a monthly, but it was printed daily. The only thing that constrained them was the availability of paper. It was one of only a few Tennessee Confederate newspapers that remained in circulation throughout the war. To stay ahead of the Union Army, the Rebel moved from town to town, soon earned the nickname Rebel on Wheels. It took 2 boxcars to move the Rebel down. The first time it moved down towards Atlanta. I assume that it took that to move it over to Selma. It moved to Selma, Alabama in 1864, and eventually that's where its presses were destroyed. Chickamauga, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of information about Chickamauga. As Rosecrans crossed Lookout Mountain, he had his army split into 3 different groups of people. Up here, Chattanooga was where Crittenden was. In the middle was Thomas, and down below was a general named McCown. Those were his 3 corps. They were not in supporting distance of each other. Bragg figured that out and decided to attack him. Hamilton County watched it unfold. As Longstreet's men from Virginia breached the Union lines, they saw a third of the army, this army, coming back towards Chattanooga. Thomas remained on the field with less than a third of the army, but he stopped the Confederate advance. He saved the Union Army from destruction. He withdrew through McFarland Gap to Rossville and Missionary Ridge, and from there he withdrew into the city. Chattanooga now had a beaten Union Army and thousands. Closest I could get to a number was 5,000 Union wounded were in Chattanooga after Chickamauga. The town was not prepared defensively. There was only a pontoon bridge across the river and 2 ferries, and the Union Army was trapped. However, and I'd never heard this quite so well described, the battle had also mauled Bragg's army, and therefore he chose to besiege the army, or the city. He had forces along Missionary Ridge, across the valley over Lookout Mountain, all the way to Raccoon Mountain. The Southern Army was strung out, but it had total control over access to the city. It controlled the railroads and the river. The Army of the Cumberland was a defeated and dispirited shadow of its prowess. It was not a fighting army by this time. Supplies for this army had to come from Bridgeport. They had to come up the Sequatchie Valley, over Signal Mountain, or down the W Road, or down a road that was up near Soddy Daisy, and I don't know where that road was. Got to the north bank, had to come across the river at the pontoon bridge. It was a 60-mile trip by wagon. After the 3rd week of the siege, they were so badly short of everything, they were placed on 1/4 rations. The soldiers were not able to have enough to eat to fight. By then, most of the civilians had departed, and Rosecrans planned to retreat from Chattanooga. That was his plan. He said, "This isn't going to work. I have a defeated army. I'm not going to stay here." However, what happened was Lincoln and his Secretary of War Stanton reacted immediately. They started sending more troops to Chattanooga. Chattanooga by then was considered, this is after the battle at Vicksburg, after the battle of Gettysburg, Chattanooga was considered the apex of the war. To lose Chattanooga was just something that Lincoln and Stanton were unwilling to do, and they were going to send whatever they needed to send here in order to protect it. The men with Hooker came from the Army of the Potomac 1,100 miles by rail. He also sent Sherman towards Chattanooga with 4 more divisions from Vicksburg. And last, he sent U.S. Grant to be in charge of the battle in Chattanooga. First thing Grant did was fire Rosecrans and put Thomas in command of the Army of the Cumberland. Chattanooga was a fort, nothing but a fort. It was a 40,000 man army in the city. Rifle pits, earthworks, every hill was either a fort, a battery, or a redoubt. On October the 2nd, Wheeler's cavalry caught a wagon train en route and completely destroyed everything they could not carry away. But the more I read about Wheeler's raid, after he did that, he went north, he went up to McMinnville, then he went across the middle Tennessee, then he started coming back down on the far side of Bridgeport, and by then his cavalry unit was just totally played out. Meanwhile, the Confederates were busy talking mutiny. Most of the generals in Davis's army wanted Davis gone. They sent letters to Jefferson Davis and said, "Get rid of Braxton Bragg." Davis arrived on October 9th to hold a conference of war. Tell you a little bit about Braxton Bragg. He was an Army officer, full general in the Confederate Army, and apparently he had something on Jefferson Davis. He was born in North Carolina. He went to West Point when he was 16. Here are some of his classmates. Hooker, who he was going to fight, was one of them. Pemberton, who had just given up Vicksburg early. Those were his classmates, the class of 1837. He graduated 5th in his class. He was a martinet. I cannot find anybody in any book with a more disliked by his own officers than Braxton Bragg. At Chattanooga, a council of his generals refused to support him. Davis listened. He asked all those people whose names you see there, what do you think I should do? All of them said, get rid of him, and he didn't. Allegedly, the reason he didn't get rid of him is he didn't have anybody to take his place. All of those generals were then transferred out of Chattanooga before the Battle of Chattanooga occurred. Now I thought you might find this interesting. This is what Chattanooga looked like in the fall of 1863. 63, yeah. All of these forts, all of these redoubts, all of these various facilities. This is a battery on East Martin Luther King Boulevard. Chattanooga was nothing but one big fortification. And Bragg decided not to attack. He decided to try to starve them out. Okay, breaking the siege. It was broken with a pontoon bridge across the Tennessee at Brown's Ferry. Actually, they took 5,000 men downriver in the dark, got across the river on the what would be called the north bank in this case, surprised the Confederates who were down there, and established a way to get from there to Bridgeport. Soon a steamboat that was built in Bridgeport would be delivering supplies up the river, would stop here, and then the supplies would be brought into the city this way. On October 28th, Hooker's Corps entered Lookout Valley, surprised Bragg and Longstreet. They were up on top of Lookout Mountain watching these 20,000 fresh Union troops coming into this valley over here. Bragg told Longstreet to drive away this new Union force. A night attack occurred at Wauhatchie, but in the darkness and confusion, the Union forces held on, and the line to Bridgeport was now open. Sherman, remember, he was coming from Vicksburg, arrived in mid-November with 4 more divisions, 20,000 additional Union soldiers. With Thomas in command of the 40,000 man Army of the Cumberland, Grant now had 80,000 men in this little area. Okay? In this little area, Grant had 80,000 men in Chattanooga. Meanwhile, and I cannot imagine what this was about, Bragg sent Longstreet to relieve Knoxville. Knoxville was considered to be the right flank of the Confederate Army in Tennessee. It was occupied by a general named Burnside, and they were going to relieve Burnside of his position with Longstreet's division. Cleburne was also sent north to support Longstreet. However, Cleburne did not get that far before the fighting actually started in Chattanooga. He immediately got back. Bragg now had less than 50,000 men. He had a position spread out all the way here and across Lookout Mountain. So they were spread very thin. The first fighting occurred on Lookout Mountain. Hooker ordered one of his generals to cross Lookout Creek and to assault Lookout Mountain. And where they came across was at the mostly around the Craven House. They did not come across the parapet. They did not get on the top of the mountain. The top of the mountain remained in Confederate hands, and then the next day they withdrew, but they were not attacked on the top. Hooker's wing had 20,000 men, but the terrain didn't let him use them all at one time on the mountain. There were only 2,000 rebels, half of whom would soon be casualties. By 3 o'clock, fog enveloped the mountain. That's where it got the name Battle Above the Clouds. The Confederates withdrew. Hooker was now east of the mountain, and he was approaching Missionary Ridge. But then he ran into Chattanooga Creek. He wasted an entire day bridging Chattanooga Creek. He's not given high marks for that particular action. But now Bragg was the besieged one. Missionary Ridge, Sherman's division. Remember now, Sherman, he crossed the Tennessee River on the morning of the 24th. So he marched, his troops came in on the north side of the river, stayed behind Stringer's Ridge. The Confederates didn't even know that Sherman and his men were there. He got up here near Chickamauga Creek, crossed the Tennessee River, and the plan was that Sherman was to come this way, Hooker was to come this way, and they would hit Bragg on both flanks, and he would crumble. However, instead of Sherman hitting Missionary Ridge, he hit something called Billy Goat Hill. There was nobody on Billy Goat Hill, but it totally discombobulated Sherman. He reorganized. He then attacked the north end of the ridge on the next day, but he ran into Cleburne's division and he was stopped cold. Meanwhile, the entire Army of the Cumberland, that's here, in the largest frontal assault in the whole Civil War, but it was called a diversion. 27,000 men online charged Missionary Ridge. Bragg had not done a very good job of designing the defenses on top of the ridge. The Army of the Cumberland was still smarting from Chickamauga. They overran Bragg's defenses. During the night, Bragg ordered his army to withdraw towards Chickamauga Station, currently out towards where the airport is, out in here. So the Confederate Army withdrew. On November 26th, the retreat commenced. The aftermath. Casualties for the Union Army were 5,800 out of about 56,000 actively engaged. Bragg reported Confederate casualties of 6,600, most of them captured out of his 44,000 engaged. One of the two remaining major armies of the Confederacy had been routed. So what Bragg did, like any good general, he relieved Breckinridge from command. Breckinridge was his right wing commander. Accused him of being drunk during the period of 23-27. He blamed Breckinridge and the cowardness of his army for the defeat. So Bragg took responsibility. He said the buck stops here and let it stop with Breckinridge. However, the next day or the next week, Bragg then resigned from command of the Army of Tennessee. He was replaced by Joseph E. Johnson in December. The Union now had total control of the state of Tennessee, including Chattanooga, which they referred to as the gateway of the lower South. Chattanooga had become, and I don't know why, I never got this in any of my education, the primary, call it jewel in the crown of the Union war up until that point. But the exhausted city was in bad condition. Thanksgiving was celebrated the next day fairly sedately. Desolation was everywhere. Every church in the city was either a hospital or it's closed. No stores were open. Strangers filled the streets of a town filled with tents. It had no milk, no butter, no cheese. Food was a real serious issue, especially for civilians. Federal forces remained in the town and controlled the governance of the city until the end of the war. I don't know that they actually declared martial law, but it was close enough. The railroads poured munitions and equipment into warehouses that were built along the river. It would be the supply base for Sherman's march to Atlanta and beyond. Refugees and casualties continued to arrive. The city was full of tents and sheds. It was almost a shanty town. To maintain the railroads, the government operated, I assume they built, a rolling mill and foundry in 1864. And from then on, the rails to keep the railroads operational were coming from Chattanooga. New hospital facilities were built, including a convalescent camp on Lookout Mountain, and another, I think the biggest hospital was over here on the North Shore in back of those buildings where the tire store is. I think that's where one of the major hospitals were. They built a military bridge across the Tennessee River, and I don't know how long that bridge was there, but I think that's the bridge that was eventually replaced by the Market Street Bridge. Sutler's Row was established. It was built primarily to do business with the soldiers, and it was price controlled by the Army. But it housed everything from tobacco to groceries to dentists to you name it. By the end of the war, the city started preparing for the future, whatever it would be. So that was Chattanooga in the Civil War. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a preview about session 2. I hope you come back. First, we're going to talk about the city recovering from the war. Then we're going to talk about carpetbaggers and others who built the industrial base in Chattanooga. After a certain number of years of being an industrial base, it became a Rust Belt city. When I grew up, Chattanooga was not an industrial beehive. Although there was still combustion engineering, there was still a lot of industry here in Chattanooga, but it had a terrible pollution problem, among other things. The Renaissance I'm going to talk about, the aquarium and all that followed. Dan's going to help me do some research on that. Talk about Volkswagen in the modern city of Chattanooga. So that's session 2 in 2 weeks. Any questions? Anybody still there?
George, I got a question.
Very good. Thank you very much.
George, I got a question.
What?
You had mentioned that before the war, there were a large number of slaves in Chattanooga.
Not a large number.
But where were they being used? Were they in the foundries or the coal plants?
Farmers?
All of the above. There were also household staffs. There was not any plantations that I have seen anything about in the area. So the slaves were in small groups. They did some work in the foundries. They did some work in the mines. They did some work wherever they were used. But there was 10% of the population was slaves as of 1861.
Yeah, but the closest plantation was probably northern Alabama or northern Mississippi, right?
Or northern Georgia, maybe.
Yeah.
I would think that farmers had them.
And farmers might have a couple.
Yeah. Okay.
They were dispersed, put it that way.
George, did you run across any information about how the Tennessee River was made navigable? Because up until the 1840s, 1850s, the area up there, the Suck Creek, destroyed a lot of boats.
They had a mechanism. And I assume that the mechanism included a bunch of ropes. Over the Suck, what they would do is rope a boat through it. So it would get to the Suck, and they would pick it up on the bank. And I assume they picked that up with either horse or oxen or mules, and they would drag it through the Suck. That's how it got through the Suck.
I see.
Most of the boats that were operating were shallow draft. And in fact, most of the material that they brought, they would bring on barges. You know, a barge draws very little.
Yeah.
So the river wasn't that deep. There were, like as I said, there were different places where it was only 3 feet deep.
Yeah, it wasn't Muscle Shoals was one of the bigger blocks in the river, right?
Right. But that was way downstream.
Yeah, right.
The boats that they used to relieve the siege actually manufactured in Bridgeport. When I say manufactured, they were built in Bridgeport. So they
Okay,
didn't use the entire Tennessee River. They used the part between here and Bridgeport. And then in Bridgeport, that's where the railroad went up to Nashville.
George, thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow morning.
Okay.
George, I believe you're going to talk about Volkswagen next time. I saw a program the other night where Volkswagen is one of the most modern plants in the world. And they showed they have acres and acres and acres of solar panels out there. And they're going to be almost 100% free of taking in the electricity and everything.
Vince, I saw the same thing, and you're right. I mean, I just went by there today. I just marvel at the Volkswagen plant. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. George, a good program, George. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good job, George. Thanks.
Thanks,
See you
George.
guys.
Thank you, George. That was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, George. Very
Thank you,
educational.
George.
I find myself struggling a little bit for words sometimes.
Thank you, George.
You're welcome.
Well,
that's hard to believe, George.
Thank you, George. Thank you, George.
You're welcome.
To go around.
all right, George. Good night.
Good night, guys.
Okay.
Signing out. See you all next week.
Got it.
How do I get out of this thing? Goodbye.
It's gone.